I spoke to Spirit last night as I was about to fly in here, and she talked about how thrilled she was to introduce me, and I was very flattered by that. And I felt like saying to her how thrilled I was to have you introduce me, because I feel close to Spirit. I feel close to Spirit's mother. Spirit's mother is just an amazing woman, and I mean, the idea, the Little Rock Nine is an amazing group, but the idea that any group of 9 people could include 2 people as truly amazing as Minnie Jean and Elizabeth, it just defies the law of averages. It's just 2 of the most extraordinary people I've ever met. And actually, the last time I talked to Minnie Jean, I said to her that I've made a lot of mistakes, as any author does writing books. You know, you make all kinds of tactical errors in the course of doing it. And one of my mistakes is that as I was gathering material on Elizabeth, I should have been putting aside material on Minnie Jean, and I should have written 2 books simultaneously. Because each of them, I mean, they're entirely different characters. It's hard to imagine 2 people more different. And yet each of them is a book. So I'm happy that Minnie Jean is doing her own book. She'll do a better job with it than I would have done, and we can all look forward to that. I want to thank all of you for showing up here. This is really, I was thinking as I was looking out at the crowd that if only the world were Little Rock, this book would be Tuesdays with Maury. And I want to thank you for showing up after the false alarm of a month or so ago. I'm a New Englander. You know, I didn't realize that with snow flurries, events are canceled. Not only are events canceled, but the town is crippled. I mean, unbelievable. It's a good thing they had a restaurant in the hotel, or I would have starved. So I was very pleased to look out my hotel window this morning and see that there were no flurries, not even any raindrops, that this was going to happen. I also want to thank Skip Rutherford, who really is somebody who makes things happen. I had not planned on this event at all. In fact, I had called him, as I periodically do, just because I'm doing additional research, and I told him I was coming to town, and he proposed this event. I mean, what I had originally imagined was that the book would come out and you'd all be able to read what I've written and ask me questions about it, and if I were lucky, Skip would invite me here and we'd have an event. You'd also be able to buy the book, and everything would be fine. And so this is all a little bit premature, but Skip assures me that I guess if I behave myself today, I'll be invited back when the book comes out, and I hope to see a lot of you then, and I'll be very happy to discuss it and sign it, and I'll look forward to that. I think it should happen in about a year. And finally, I just want to, I'm sort of a little bit there are too many butterflies in my stomach to do a systematic review of the audience, but I know that there are some people in the audience I've interviewed. I suspect there are other people I've interviewed, but only over the phone, and so therefore I don't recognize you. But I'm flattered that you all came. I see the great Annie Abrams, who's been a big help to me in doing this book and understanding some very important historical questions about Little Rock. I see Ralph Brody, and I'm happy that Ralph is here. I've interviewed him, and you know, he's an important part of the story, and I'm flattered that he's here. And Phil and Ruthie Kaplan, I know, are somewhere. Phil and Ruthie Kaplan where are they? There they are, right in the second row. They are like my local USO. They entertain me and give me a taste of home whenever I come to Little Rock, and I'm very happy that they're here. So anyway, the book, in a sense, this talk today is a little bit premature because the book is still a work in progress. It's still taking shape in my mind. It's almost done. I'm interviewing people still. In fact, I'm here to interview a few more people and sort of mop up. I expect to hand the book in about a month. And this will be even giving this talk today is a little bit of a conceit from me. It really is the first sign that the book is almost finished. So you're helping me to celebrate what's been a very, very long process. It started, and there was an anniversary last year that no one but I would have noted. Last year was the 10th anniversary of my starting this book. Not an occasion that was marked at the Visitors Center. And it started very, very innocuously. I was here to do a Clinton-related story about somebody whose picture I don't quite remember seeing in the museum next door. I was here to do a story for Vanity Fair about Paula Jones, if you remember her. And while I was here, of course, I knew all about Little Rock Central High School. The picture was part of my education, and the picture was something that I don't remember when I first saw it, but I never forgot it once I saw it, and so it was very much a part of my consciousness. And I went to the Visitors Center, of course, in coming to Little Rock, and there I saw the reconciliation poster to which Spirit alluded, and I was just blown away by it. I hadn't heard anything about this. This was in 1999, so it was 2 years after it was first taken, and I didn't know anything about the fact that these two women had come together again, and I thought, hell, this is a much better story than the one I'm working on, much more important. That story, incidentally, never got written, and that's quite all right with me. Anyway, so I instantly started asking questions about the situation, how that poster had come to be, how the reconciliation had come to be, what the status of it was. And it was then that I first met Elizabeth and Hazel and started to report on what I thought at the time would be just a simple story. In fact, I didn't even talk to my editors about the story. It's one of those things that you just know that, I mean, the original photograph itself is a story, as any great picture is. I mean, you could do a story about, you know, the young naked girl in Vietnam running after being napalmed, or any of these, any iconic picture is a story. And yet here was a story that had a second chapter and maybe a third chapter. And so I thought, well, this is just, I couldn't believe that it was out there. So I've been working on it ever since. I don't want you to think it's all that I've been doing. I've had a day job too, and most of which was spent writing stories for Vanity Fair, and as Spirit said, I wrote another book in the meantime, a much longer and more ambitious book than this one. This is really going to be a short book. I hope it's going to be a short and elegant book. It's not going to be very thick. I hope that it's dense and beautiful and meaningful, but one thing it won't be is long. It won't be a doorstop, the way that some of my other books have been, for better or for worse. I want to, rather than talk about what the book will say, I just want to give you a sense for how I've been going about doing it and what I've been up to. And I want to keep a very clear sense of time here, Skip, so you can give me signals when, as I was telling Nikolai before, I don't know whether I have 15 minutes or 50 minutes worth of things to say. I haven't written them out. I've just sort of gotten an outline here. Anyway, so in the intervening 11 years now that I've been working on this is what I've been up to. First of all, I've done a lot of interviews. I haven't quite talked to everybody in Little Rock, but I've tried to find everybody of any relevance to the story, and I've done a lot of interviews. I've probably been to Little Rock 10 times for this, although I've never counted that. First of all, I've spoken at great length with Elizabeth Eckford, and as Spirit said, she's taking me into her confidence, and I feel very flattered and humbled by that. She's not somebody who's opened up a lot, and I'm very pleased that she's felt that I was worthy of it, and I've spoken a lot to her. I've spoken less, but still a significant amount to Hazel. For those, I guess all of you know Hazel Bryan Massery is the white girl in the picture. There are a lot of people in the picture, but she's the one everybody remembers, and she's the one whose face everybody knows. And I've spoken a lot to her. More recently, originally, she didn't want to cooperate in the story, and but gradually, I think in large part, well, I know that like many people, she was wary of some outsider coming in and not telling her story accurately or fairly or open-mindedly. And I think that things changed only when the Vanity Fair story appeared. I was lucky in that regard that people could sort of get a midterm indication of where I was going with this. And so she could see, and I'd like to think that she saw that, that I was fair-minded about this and not judgmental and trying to write something honest and open-minded, and that my motivation was genuine and productive. I've spoken to 7 of the 8 of the Little Rock 9, some at greater length than others, including Minnie Jean, although I still have more questions for her. I've tried to speak to as many people who know the Little Rock 9 as possible. I've tracked down school teachers, people who were at Central at the time. Teachers, tried to find people who taught Elizabeth there. I've spoken to as many people as I could find who saw the picture in 1957, including Julian Bond, and were affected by it, and remembered the impact that the picture had. Some of their stories are very powerful. I mean, the picture changed people's lives. There was one guy I interviewed, one of my former colleagues at the New York Times, a guy named David Shipler, who some of you will know, and he told me about the effect of that picture had on him when he was, I think he was 10 years old when he saw it. That's the age at which a picture like that has an effect on someone, and it changed the course of his life. It changed what he wrote about. He interviewed Martin Luther King. His first interview when he went to college was with Martin Luther King, and it went on. He later wrote an important book on civil rights, and all of that was affected by the image of this black girl walking through a mob. So there are a lot of stories like that, and I've tried to find as many as I could. I interviewed the photographer, Will Counts. Will Counts died several years ago. I was lucky enough to catch him. He was already sick, but he was still going around. He was giving talks on the photograph, and he was a lovely man, and I had a nice interview with him. I wasn't lucky enough to find, there were other photographers. The real aficionados of this subject will know that there were several pictures like that taken at almost the same instant. And in fact, when you go to the Visitors Center, the picture that's hanging at the Visitors Center is not the one that Will Counts took. It's one that the photographer for the UP took, a guy named Johnny Jenkins. Well, with the compulsiveness of any author working on something like this, I tried to find Johnny Jenkins. Johnny Jenkins died in 1992, but I know more about him than most people do by now. I tracked down his widow. I tried to find out whatever I could about him. And there was another picture in the there was another picture taken by a photographer named Dinkins for the Memphis Commercial Appeal that was taken almost at the same instance as the famous ones. What's interesting about that is that the picture did not run in the Memphis Commercial Appeal. Really an amazing picture, a Pulitzer Prize-worthy picture that the Memphis paper did not see fit to run. They ran a much more innocuous picture. Well, this is part of the politics of newspapering, that I think they probably just didn't want that incendiary picture in their paper, but it's in their files, and so I've tracked that down. I talked to one of the advantages. The last book that I did was about a prize fight that took place in 1938, and anybody who remembered that or was part of that was in his late 80s or 90s. I mean, it was just very hard to track anybody down, and I leapfrogged up 2 decades. So now I'm up into the 50s, and the actuarial tables are more in my favor, and so I managed to find a lot of the reporters who covered Little Rock in those days, including many of the local ones, Ray Mosley, Jerry Dunnow. Some of these names people here will remember. Roy Reed, Gene Foreman. That's not me, Annie, that's you. Annie, this is more important. One of the classiest bylines ever in the New York Times was a guy named Farnsworth Fowle. I even found him. I mean, he in his 80s, living in the Bronx. The reporter for the New York Herald Tribune, I interviewed him. I tried to track down the people who covered it as a television story. This is an interesting issue because television was still in its infancy in those days. John Chancellor covered the story. Of course, he had died, a guy from CBS named Robert Shackney. What's interesting about the television coverage of it is that television had very, I guess in modern parlance, television had very low self-esteem in those days and didn't save anything. So there's there's very little footage of television of the actual presentation of the events that day. You can't watch a tape of the Huntley-Brinkley report for that night or Douglas Edwards and actually see how the events in Little Rock were presented. It just was not saved. But that's part of the story. Then I did a lot of reading. Of course, I read the local newspapers, which covered the story very aggressively, but in entirely different ways, as those of you who remember when the Democrat and Gazette were different papers will instantly attest to. I mean, the Democrat was hostile to desegregation, and the Gazette was much more sympathetic towards it, though still from a certain distance. I read the national papers, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, a lot of the big papers in those days. This was when newspapers were still fat and rich and could send reporters to cover a story like this, and so many of them had people here. I also looked at the black papers, which were a very important resource, not as important as in the 1930s because integration had already made inroads in journalism, and many of the most talented black reporters were already working on big city papers, mainstream white papers. But the black papers continued and sent reporters here. I mean, the famous photograph of Alec Wilson being beaten that Will Counts also took, well, he was working for the Tri-State Defender, which was the black paper out of Memphis, the weekly black paper out of Memphis. And some of the reporting in the black papers from people whose names have been almost completely forgotten is very powerful and very moving and deserves to be commemorated. Ethel Payne, who was really the dean of the black women reporters and really the dean of black reporters in those days, came and wrote some very memorable stuff. There was a guy named Buddy Lonesome from the St. Louis Argus. These are papers that I think I'm pretty sure don't exist anymore. I turn to you, for, I figure I'm safe if I turn to you. If you shake your head no, then I'm on safe ground. Then of course I've read a lot of the books. Betsy Jakeway, I don't know if Betsy is here today, but Betsy Jakeway's book, Mrs. Huckabee's book, the recent books by Jefferson, by Terrence Roberts and Carlotta Walls. I've read these. I have Griff Stockley's books, which I have not read yet, but I absolutely will before I finish mine. It would be a dereliction of duty if I didn't read them. And I had a very nice get-together with Griff the last time I was here, and felt very lucky for that. I went to different libraries. I've been to Fayetteville to go through Mrs. Huckabee's papers. Mrs. Huckabee was sort of a pack rat, and she saved a lot of different things. She saved the detention slips and the truancy reports and the disciplinary notes for all of the people who were making trouble at Central High School. Her original journal is there, her diary, where she'd come home and write of her upset and what was going on at Central each day. The original manuscript of the book that she wrote on Crisis at Central High is there, and as a writer loves to discover, there are materials in the original manuscript that did not make the published version, including stuff that's very relevant to me. So the result of, and then I went to the Library of Congress, I looked at Kenneth Clark's papers. The sociologist Kenneth Clark came out to Little Rock and interviewed the Little Rock Nine, and his reports on each of them are there. I don't think anybody had ever looked at those before. There's nothing embarrassing about your mother. But there's a lot of insightful stuff. There was another fellow, this was one of my serendipitous discoveries. There was a guy from MIT named Harold Isaacs who also came out to Little Rock in 1957, and I found his stuff is at MIT, and I went there. So the result of all of this, the book will be about 50,000 words, which means nothing to people who aren't in the writing business. But it's not, it's probably a couple hundred pages. And in that book is a whole universe. I mean, we love footnotes and digressions. Oprah Winfrey is in it. Mike Wallace is in it, as Ralph Brody knows. Ralph knows Mike Wallace's connection to the story. Langston Hughes is in it. Sputnik is in it because Sputnik, of course, went up a month or two after, a month after the picture of Elizabeth was taken. Jackie Robinson is in it. Hannah Arendt is in it. W.E.B. Du Bois is in it. Langston Hughes is in it. Thurgood Marshall is in it. Louis Armstrong is in it. The entire cast of South Pacific is in it. Dunbar High School is in it. 9th Street is in it. The Arkansas School for the Deaf and Blind Negro is in it. Wiley Branton Sr. and Jr. are in it. Judge Marion Humphrey is in it. Sidney Williams, a graduate of, I guess, Dunbar High School, and the first black quarterback in the Big Ten is in it. It's populated with interesting people. Grace Lorch is in it. Grace Lorch was the woman who sat next to Elizabeth on the bench as she waited for the bus to pick her up after the picture was taken. That's a very moving story. I mean, everywhere you turn, you find very powerful stories. Lee Lorch, the husband, is 95 years old. He was one of the white professors who taught at Philander Smith. He taught at Philander Smith because he was basically run out of every other more prestigious school he taught at because of his civil rights activities. I interviewed his daughter. His daughter, I mean, this is the kind of story that you come across. She told me a story. I mean, they were white civil rights agitators. They were communists. They confirmed every charge that the civil rights movement was a communist plot. And they were very prominent in the story, and she was prominent for sitting next to Elizabeth and sort of trying to protect her that day. And when I interviewed the daughter, she told me the story about how one night a black man came to their house. They lived in the black neighborhood. They lived near Daisy Bates. And he came, and as soon as they opened the door, he insisted that they turn out all the lights. He didn't want anybody to see him there. And he had a big bag with him. And when he went into the house and he felt secure, he opened the bag and poured out the contents, and they were letters. They were letters to Professor and Mrs. Lorch. And why did he have them? Because he worked in the post office.